This is the moment Donald Trump's entire Middle East strategy collapsed in a single afternoon. Close your eyes and picture something. Picture a narrow strip of water, just 21 miles wide at its tightest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. That strip of water, the Strait of Hormuz, moves roughly 1/5 of all the oil on planet Earth every single day. Tankers the size of city blocks pass through it constantly, loaded with fuel that heats homes in Germany, powers factories in South Korea, and fills gas tanks across America. It is, without question, the most important waterway in the world economy. Now picture that waterway shut, not slowed down, not restricted, shut. And picture the country that controls access to it flying its foreign minister to Moscow on a Tuesday morning to sit across from Vladimir Putin and build an alliance designed specifically to make sure America cannot force it back open. That is not a hypothetical. That happened today. Tuesday, April 28th, 2025, at 10:14 a.m. Moscow time, Iran's Foreign Minister Araqchi landed in Russia, walked into the Kremlin, and shook hands with the man America has spent 3 years trying to isolate. And as that handshake happened, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer picked up a phone and delivered a message to the White House that can only be described as a warning shot from America's closest friend. And Iran's foreign ministry stood before cameras and said with total confidence that the Strait of Hormuz will never return to what it was. Not after a deal, not after a ceasefire, not ever. Donald Trump, already bleeding from a trade war that raised prices for American families, already under pressure from a public that is tired of paying $4 a gallon, and already watching his approval rating sink to the lowest point of his presidency, has just been blindsided by the worst strategic collapse of his second term. In this deep dive, we are going to show you exactly how the Iran-Russia alliance changes the entire calculation of this war. Why Britain's warning to Trump is more alarming than anyone in the mainstream press is telling you, and what Iran's declaration about Hormuz actually means for your wallet, your country, and the next 10 years of global energy. Trump isn't just losing a negotiation. He is watching his entire foreign policy architecture burn down in real time. 18 months ago, Donald Trump walked back into the White House with a promise that was loud, clear, and specific. He was going to fix the Middle East. He was going to be so tough on Iran that Tehran would beg to come to the table. He was going to use American military and economic power to force a permanent nuclear deal, drive Iran's oil revenue to zero, and deliver a moment of total domination that no previous president had managed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Apply maximum pressure and sanctions so total, a naval blockade so complete, and military strikes so precise that Iran would have no choice but to surrender its nuclear program, accept American terms, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz on America's schedule. Trump sold this to the American people as a 90-day operation. His advisors said it publicly. They said Iran's economy was already too weak to hold out. They said Tehran was desperate. They said the pressure would work fast. But the cost was not just economic pain for Iran. The cost was something far deeper. To run this blockade, America had to pull naval assets away from the Pacific at a moment when China was watching every move very closely. To fund this operation, the Pentagon burned through $2.7 billion in the first 60 days alone. And to maintain the political coalition needed at home, Trump had to keep promising that the pain at the pump was temporary, tied directly to the negotiations, and that the moment Iran surrendered, everything would go back to normal. Allies in Europe were uncomfortable from day one. France and Britain said publicly they would not join the blockade. Germany warned that energy market disruptions could trigger a recession. The Gulf states, with their own complicated relationships with Tehran, said nothing and watched carefully. But Trump dismissed every concern. His team told reporters privately that the Europeans always complain and always fall in line. They said America's leverage was total. They said Iran had no real options, no real allies, and no real way out. He assumed Russia would stay on the sidelines. He assumed China would not move to help Iran absorb the pressure. He assumed Iran's leadership would prioritize economic survival over geopolitical pride. He assumed Hormuz would reopen the moment a deal was signed. He assumed wrong. On every single count, he assumed wrong. And the bill for those assumptions came due today. At 10:14 a.m. Moscow time this morning, a state aircraft carrying Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchi touched down at Vnukovo Airport. There was no press conference waiting, no cameras from Iranian state TV for the arrival. Just a quiet motorcade, a drive through Moscow's gray spring morning, and a meeting inside the Kremlin that American intelligence analysts have been dreading for months. For 6 hours, there was silence from both sides. No readout, no statement, no photograph. Then, at 4:30 p.m. Moscow time, the Kremlin released a single image. Araqchi seated across from Putin, both men leaning forward, both men with the calm, settled look of people who have already made their decisions and are simply formalizing them. The statement that followed was 200 words, but those 200 words contained something that sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry that received the translation. Russia and Iran had agreed to expand bilateral economic cooperation, establish alternative financial channels outside the dollar system, and deepen their strategic partnership across military, energy, and diplomatic channels. Pause. Read that again slowly. Alternative financial channels outside the dollar system. That is not routine diplomatic language. That is a direct, explicit message to Washington that the sanctions regime, the entire economic pressure campaign that Trump has staked his foreign policy credibility on, has just been handed a lifeline by the one country powerful enough to blunt it. But while that meeting was happening in Moscow, something else was also happening simultaneously that most of the American press completely buried. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer made a direct call to Donald Trump. And according to the official readout released by Downing Street, Starmer did not call to offer support. He called to warn. His exact language, as published by the British government, described what he called severe and worsening consequences for the global economy and for the cost of living of ordinary people in the United Kingdom. He told Trump there was an urgent need, his words, urgent need, to get shipping moving through the Strait of Hormuz again. This is Britain, America's oldest ally, the country that has stood beside America through every major conflict of the last century. And it called the President of the United States to say, directly and formally, that what you are doing is hurting our people and you need to stop. And while the Kremlin meeting was finalizing and while Starmer's warning was being delivered, the Iranian Foreign Ministry held a press briefing in Tehran that dropped the single most significant statement of this entire crisis. A spokesperson said that the Strait of Hormuz will under no circumstances return to its previous state, not after a nuclear deal, not after a ceasefire, not after negotiations of any kind. The waterway that existed before February 28, 2025, is, in Iran's official position, gone permanently. Oil markets responded instantly. Brent crude jumped 4.2% in afternoon trading, hitting $91 a barrel. Gas futures climbed again for the sixth consecutive session. At the pump across America today, the average price sits at $4.38 per gallon, up from $3.94 just 3 weeks ago. And analysts at JPMorgan issued an alert within 2 hours of Iran's statement projecting that prices could hit $4.80 by July if no diplomatic breakthrough emerges. The market does not care about press secretary statements. It cares about supply, and supply just got a lot more uncertain. According to sources with direct knowledge of deliberations inside the State Department, the Araqchi-Putin meeting was not a surprise to American intelligence. The CIA had been tracking the diplomatic signals for 3 weeks. Back-channel communications between Tehran and Moscow had accelerated significantly after the U.S. extended its naval blockade to cover Iranian cargo vessels in the Gulf of Oman on April 11th. We have learned from senior officials familiar with the internal discussions that a classified briefing was delivered to senior White House staff on April 21st, 8 days ago, warning that Iran was actively constructing what the briefing described as a sanctions absorption architecture, a financial and logistical framework designed specifically to allow Iran to survive the blockade indefinitely with Russian support. An emergency call took place between the National Security Advisor and the Treasury Secretary on the evening of April 22nd. The participants included 3 senior officials from the Sanctions Enforcement Division and a representative from the intelligence community. The topic, according to a source present at that meeting, was blunt. They sat around a table and someone said, "If Russia steps fully into this gap, we have a problem that maximum pressure cannot solve." A senior Treasury official reportedly replied, "Then we need the president to understand that we are no longer operating with the same assumptions we started with." The president was briefed the following morning. According to 2 sources familiar with the meeting, Trump's first response was to ask whether new sanctions on Russia could be implemented quickly. His advisors told him that new Russia sanctions would risk fracturing the G7 coalition that has kept European partners aligned since the Ukraine war. Trump reportedly pushed the table and said the whole thing was being mismanaged. He left the room before the briefing was finished. It was a cold, calculated assessment by the people around him. They looked at the Russia-Iran alignment and understood what it meant for the blockade's fundamental theory. They looked at the Starmer call and understood that America's closest ally was beginning to publicly distance itself from the strategy. They looked at the gas prices and understood that the political cost at home was rising faster than the diplomatic leverage abroad. They realized that the plan that was supposed to take 90 days was now in serious danger of becoming a multi-year quagmire with no clear exit. The decision was made quietly among senior staff that someone needed to deliver the president a different kind of message. Nobody wanted that job. Why did Russia do this? Follow the logic, because it is not complicated once you see it clearly. Russia has been under Western sanctions since 2022. Russia has been cut off from major portions of the global financial system. Russia has watched America pour weapons and money into Ukraine for 3 years, and Russia has been sitting very patiently, waiting for a moment when America overextends itself somewhere else and creates an opening. That opening arrived on February 28, 2025, the day Trump launched the Iran campaign. Every week America is locked in the Persian Gulf is a week America is not focused on NATO's eastern flank. Every $1 billion spent on the blockade is $1 billion not going to Ukraine. Every diplomatic conversation dominated by Iran is a conversation not happening about Russia. Russia does not need to fire a single bullet to benefit enormously from this situation. All it needs to do is what it did today. Fly one foreign minister to Moscow and sign one agreement. And suddenly, the entire pressure campaign that America built against Iran starts leaking air. This shifts power dramatically. Trump can no longer claim that Iran is isolated, because Iran is not isolated. Iran now has a patron with a UN Security Council veto, a parallel financial system, and a military-industrial base that has been running on wartime footing for 3 years. He can no longer credibly threaten that the economic pressure will force Iran's hand, because the economic pressure now has a pressure valve. He is just the guy standing outside a room where 2 other countries are quietly rewriting the rules of the game. Historically, analysts will call what happened today a strategic inflection point. This is the moment that transforms a maximum pressure campaign into a prolonged stalemate. It is not Vietnam meeting the Middle East. It is something potentially worse, a situation where America's most powerful economic tools are being systematically neutralized in real time by a partner with enough resources, enough patience, and enough motivation to hold out indefinitely. The legal and constitutional dimensions are beginning to attract attention as well. 3 senior Democratic senators sent a formal letter to the White House today demanding a full congressional briefing on the Iran strategy. The letter states explicitly that Congress has not authorized an extended military and economic campaign of this scale and duration, and that the administration's failure to present a coherent theory of resolution may constitute a violation of the War Powers Act. This is not the opposition complaining. This is the legislative branch formally asserting its authority. And if that letter becomes a formal resolution, it could trigger a constitutional confrontation that forces the White House into an impossible choice. Here is the domino effect as it stands right now, laid out as simply as possible. If Russia's financial channels successfully allow Iran to sell its oil outside the dollar system, then the blockade's economic pressure drops significantly. If the blockade's pressure drops significantly, then Iran has even less reason to make nuclear concessions. If Iran has less reason to make concessions, then the war extends by months or years. If the war extends, gas stays at $4.38 or higher through 2025 and likely into 2026. And if gas stays elevated that long, the political damage to Donald Trump becomes something that even his most loyal base cannot ignore. We are looking at a situation where the strategy designed to deliver a historic win becomes the anchor that pulls an entire presidency underwater. China is watching this. Beijing has been running calculations on American overextension for years, and what it sees in the Persian Gulf today is a superpower that has committed enormous resources to a campaign that is now facing strategic headwinds it did not anticipate. That changes Taiwan calculations. It changes South China Sea calculations. A weakened, distracted, overextended America is exactly what China has been waiting for. And the meeting in Moscow today just handed Beijing a front-row seat. Where is Congress in all of this? Silence. Republican leadership has not called a single hearing on the Iran strategy. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee has not publicly demanded a briefing. The House Armed Services Committee has been quiet. Why? Because they are running their own calculations. They see the gas prices. They see the polls. They see the Russia-Iran axis forming. And they are making a very deliberate choice to stay distant from a strategy that is beginning to look like a trap. Reports from people inside the White House describe a president who has become consumed by cable news coverage of the Iran situation. He is reportedly watching television for hours each day, tracking poll numbers on the war more obsessively than any other metric, and repeatedly asking his staff why the story is not being covered the way he wants it covered. Staff have begun limiting the number of negative briefings they bring to him at once. They are managing his information diet in a way that senior officials find alarming. He is experiencing the specific psychological state of a leader whose plan has stopped working, but who does not yet have a new plan to replace it. The Strait of Hormuz was always the picture frame of this entire strategy. Trump wanted to use it as leverage, close it, reopen it, call it a win, go home. What Iran understood, and what Russia understood, and what the markets understood long before the White House did, is that once you weaponize a choke point that critical, the world does not simply reset when you stop. The picture frame does not go back on the wall. It stays broken on the floor. And broken is now Iran's strongest negotiating position. You can manipulate poll numbers, but you cannot manipulate oil futures. You can spin a press conference, but you cannot spin $4.38 gas into a victory lap. You can call something a success on Truth Social, but you cannot call it that to a family in Ohio that is cutting back on groceries to pay for the commute. Reality, as it always does, is catching up. So where are we right now? Trump is inside a White House where his own advisors are managing his information. The British Prime Minister has formally warned him. His blockade is losing effectiveness by the day as Russia builds Iran an escape route. Iran has declared Hormuz permanently changed. Oil is at $91 a barrel and climbing. Congress is beginning to circle, and his approval on foreign policy has dropped to 31%, the lowest of either of his terms. He is simultaneously the most powerful man in the world and the most cornered. He has the largest military on earth and no clear way to use it that makes the situation better. He has the most sophisticated sanctions apparatus ever built and a partner state actively dismantling it piece by piece. As we move through the coming weeks, expect Trump to escalate the rhetoric dramatically. He will try to reframe the Russia-Iran meeting as proof that America's pressure is working. He might try to announce a new package of secondary sanctions targeting Russian entities that do business with Iran. He could even try to threaten military action against Russia-linked shipping as a show of resolve. But what cannot be undone is the signal that was sent today in Moscow, that Iran is not alone, that the blockade has limits, and that America's theory of victory depends on assumptions that no longer hold. The alliance that was supposed to be impossible has been built. The waterway that was supposed to reopen has been declared permanently changed. And the partner that was supposed to stay quiet called London, not Washington, to talk about what happens next. Subscribe. We are going to be tracking every development in this story in real time. If Russia moves to formally ratify its financial agreement with Iran, we will break it down the moment it drops. If Congress files the War Powers Challenge, we will go live. This is not a news cycle. This is history. Watch closely. The world you knew on February 27th is not coming back.